All right, so have you ever heard the word grandiloquence? It's a
Well,
fun one, isn't it?
yeah.
A little bit of a mouthful,
Yep.
but it's what we're diving into today. This whole idea of using language to kind of, boost yourself up, sound impressive. It's kind of fascinating when you think about it.
Yeah, definitely. Our source actually dives into this whole concept of grandiloquence. And it's interesting because they suggest that people who use this kind of over the top language are often trying to overcompensate for something.
Oh, like they're trying to hide behind a wall of fancy words. That's pretty insightful. So what's the psychology behind that? Why do we feel this need to impress others with our vocabulary?
It's a good question, and the source kind of hints at a few different possibilities, right? It could be the desire for status, maybe a need for validation, or even a calculated tactic to gain some kind of advantage.
Right, like in that example they gave about high-stakes gambling.
Yeah.
I mean, in those situations, maybe a little grandiloquence is part of the game.
Yeah, and that's where things get a bit murky, right? Because if everyone's trying to sound like an expert, how do you actually tell who's the real deal?
Exactly, it's like a verbal arms race.
Yeah.
So is the source saying that sometimes it's okay to exaggerate, to play the game a bit, even if it means sacrificing some authenticity?
Well, they do bring up that point, but they also caution against it. Because even if you win a few hands by bluffing, eventually people will catch on, and when they do, that trust is broken.
So it's a short-term gain, but a potential long-term loss.
Hmm.
Because in the end, authenticity builds stronger relationships, right?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, though, doesn't it? If we stripped away all the fancy jargon, would we be better communicators, more honest with each other?
That's an interesting question and one that maybe we can all think about. And, speaking of jargon, that's another area the source dives into.
Ah, yes, jargon. It's like this secret code that only certain people have access to, which can be useful, I guess, but
Yeah.
also pretty alienating if you're not in the know.
Right. They point out that while it can be efficient for communication among experts, it can also be a huge barrier for everyone else.
Yeah, imagine trying to understand a legal document full of legalese. You practically need a translator.
Mm.
So how do we find that balance between clarity and, I guess, showing our expertise?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we communicate effectively without alienating our audience? The source emphasizes the importance of tailoring language to your audience. It's about building connections, not walls. It's really key.
I love that building bridges instead of walls.
Yeah.
Have you ever been in a situation where the jargon was just so thick you felt completely lost, like you were in a different country almost?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It can be incredibly frustrating, especially when you're trying to learn something new. It can make you feel like you're not smart enough, which is definitely not the goal.
Exactly. It's about being inclusive in our communication, right?
Yeah.
Making sure everyone feels like they're part of the conversation.
Uh,
Which is a good segue into our next topic, actually, the impact of technology on language.
it really has changed things, hasn't it? This whole online world, I mean.
It really has. It's like our source was saying how everything online is so much more casual now. Like we've developed a whole new way of talking to each other.
It makes you wonder, though, doesn't it, if all this casualness is spilling over into other parts of our lives? Like, is it affecting how we write a formal email or, even a cover letter for a job? Our source actually mentions this.
That's a great point. It makes me think like, what if we all started using emojis in our cover letters? Would that be a good thing or a bad thing?
Huh. I'm not sure about that. But it's interesting to think about, isn't it? Like, is technology actually making us less articulate when we need to be formal? What do you think?
I don't know. It's a tough one. There's definitely something to be said for being able to communicate clearly and professionally when you need to. But maybe there's also room for a little more personality in those formal settings too. Speaking of personality, our source also talks about the importance of humor in communication.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Humor can be so powerful. They talk about how it can make a message more relatable, more likable. And I think that's so true.
Absolutely. Like think about a time when someone used humor to really get their point across. It could be a teacher, a friend, even a comedian. What was it about their approach that made it work? Was it the timing, the delivery, or was it something else entirely?
It's funny because humor can be so effective, but it can also be really tricky. I'm curious, do you think there are times when humor is just totally inappropriate? Like, where do we draw the line?
Oh, wow, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From trying to sound super smart to all the ways tech is changing how we talk. It's a lot to think about.
It really is. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is just how important intention is when it comes to communication. Are we trying to connect or are we trying to impress?
Right, like are we being genuine or just putting on a show? And I think that's something our source really emphasizes, like being aware of why we're saying what we're saying.
Exactly. And also being aware of how our words are being received. Because even if our intentions are good, if we're not communicating clearly, we can still create misunderstandings, especially with all the jargon and slang floating around these days.
Oh, for sure. It's like we're all speaking different languages sometimes.
Right.
And technology definitely adds another layer to that whole mix, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's like the Wild West out there online. Anything goes, which can be fun and creative, but also, like you said, a bit confusing sometimes.
So where does this all leave us? If we're constantly bombarded with fancy words and online slang and everyone's trying to sound impressive, are we losing the ability to just have a genuine conversation?
That's a really thought-provoking question, and I think it's one we all need to be asking ourselves. Our source kind of hints at this idea that with all the carefully crafted online personas, maybe we're all becoming a little too focused on appearing grandiloquent.
Like we're so busy trying to project this perfect image of ourselves online
Yeah.
that we forget how to just be real, you know?
Right, and it makes you wonder if in all that striving for perfection, are we missing out on real connection? Because at the end of the day, isn't that what communication is all about?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Building relationships, sharing ideas, and just understanding each other better. So I
Hmm.
guess the challenge for all of us is to find that balance between expressing ourselves authentically and still being mindful of how our words might be perceived. Because language is powerful.
It really is. And the more aware we are of that power, the better equipped we'll be to use it for good, to build bridges instead of walls.
Hmm.
So as you go about your day today, just take a moment to notice the language you're using and the language you're hearing. Are you being intentional? Are you being clear? And most importantly, are you being yourself? Because that's what really matters.
I love that. Be yourself. Great advice to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of language and communication. Until next time, keep those conversations flowing and keep those connections strong.